the seminar today. So welcome and good afternoon, everybody, to today's webinar. So my name is Nick Lord. I'm a professor of criminology in the School of Social Sciences, and I'm very pleased to welcome today, not to Manchester, but virtually from Cardiff, Professor Mike Levi, who is a professor of criminology in the School of Social Sciences in Cardiff. Mike and I have known each other for some time now. He was my PhD supervisor, so it's always a pleasure to host and chair these sessions that Mike's involved in. But just to give you a very short, brief background about Mike. So for many years now, he's been developing a very distinguished track record in research into white-collar crime, financial crime, organised crime, and of course, cybercrime as well. And just to give you a flavour of the kind of prestige that Mike is held in. So last year, 2019, Mike was won the Lifetime Achievement Award at the American Society of Criminology from their division of white collar and corporate crime. He also last year won the Outstanding Achievement Award as part of the British Society of Criminology. And he also won another Lifetime Achievement Award at the inaugural Tackling Economic Crime Awards. So that was in December. So that just gives you an idea of the kind of research that Mike has produced over the years, but also the policy relevance that his work has had as well. And Mike contributes to the discourse and debates around financial crime, both domestically and internationally. His work has global reach. So we're very privileged today to be able to hear from Mike about some of his more recent work and research into cybercrime. He'll be speaking about responses to cyber-enabled scams and fears of cybercrime, rethinking the standard models. So I'll pass over to Mike in a moment, but just one bit of housekeeping. If you have questions for Mike, please submit those via the chat function on Zoom, and we'll raise those at the end of the presentation to Mike, just to save us from having an influx of questions at the end. So feel free to raise those questions as and when they come to mind. But without further ado, I'll now pass over to Mike to start his presentation.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a shame not to be in rainy or sunny Manchester. I was brought up for part of my life there, so I know how often it's dry and sunny. Yes, I mean, if the question is too hard, I might act like a government minister and just bugger off. But I'll try and go through. The angle of the camera in this Dell thing is a bit weird because it's in the bottom, so it looks as though I'm looking up, but maybe I'm looking for that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow in this photograph. So what I'm going to try and do today, I was always told you had to have goals, but most of my goals are own goals. But basically, government strategies have involved adapting counter-terrorism control models to everything. And I'll be critiquing that a little bit. But my aim is to look at public and private policing, to consider what may be required to satisfice. That's a term from administrative social science. It means basically satisfying up to a point. Both victimization of individuals, repeat victimization, that was a concept developed at Manchester quite a lot by Ken Pease, and fear of cyber scams. Now the 4Ps model, for those of you not familiar with it, basically was taken over from counter-terrorism. Prevent, that's leading people away from the path of vice towards the path of virtue. And of course, that's what we're supposed to do as part of the university, countering extremism, violent extremism, obligation. But that's ill understood in the research I've done with business people and with ordinary people. You know, you talk about the prevent function, people think it's about crime prevention. You know, that's the natural language we're used to, but it's actually, in this particular case, means a kind of life course model of leading people out of temptation to commit crime. in the CT model. So it doesn't work very well outside of counterterrorism. Then there's pursue, which is the traditional police and criminal justice approach of nicking people and bringing them to justice, though somewhat delayed, and not just because of the closure of criminal courts, but also because of COVID. Prepare, that's primary prevention, and protect, that's basically, in this case, resilience after first strike. And this was rolled out to all serious and organized crime, including, as Yong used here, human trafficking and modern slavery. But it's just a typology. It actually tells us nothing at all about what to prioritize given scarce resources. And the point about terrorist incidents, as I was in the Old Bailey when the IRA blew it up in the first bombing in mainland Britain. But terrorism and some organized and cyber crimes are very high drama. Yeah, so when the whole of the city of Atlanta is paralyzed, or our hospitals are by the WannaCry virus, then that's high drama stuff. Whereas a lot of the cyber scams that I'm going to be talking about briefly are not. So this issue about how you prioritize from this typology and what you focus limited resources on is very much up for grabs, and there has been no clear discussion of that. Now, I'm not going to go on about cyber-enabled and cyber-dependent. David Wall, one of my colleagues from Leeds, first developed this, and Peter Grabowski from Australia. But it was a more useful distinction when smartphones and ICT were not ubiquitous. I mean, but the key is that fraud can happen offline. It can happen in hybrid forms, partly online, partly offline, like a lot of interpersonal scams using voice over internet protocol, as well as wholly online, like romance scams. Many people here may think all romance is a scam, but I'm not going to go there. The Eurobarometer has been tracking European attitudes and experiences to cybercrime for quite some years. And this is an example from the most recent one in 2020. It's still the EU 28 at that time. Of course, it isn't now. But the data in that give you an idea not just of single victimization, but also repeat victimization. How many people were victimized more than once? And that's actually quite an important feature of the whole victimized experience, as it is with domestic violence and burglary and other kinds of events. So, you know, you can look at that another time, but there's quite a high level of victimization. And if you look at the UK data, fraud is mostly online fraud is responsible for about a third of crime in England and Wales now. And pre-COVID personal cybercrime, you have an increased risk of victimization if you sell stuff on auction sites. If you use university computers, you use public computers. If you're younger, if you're poorer, and if you're in a country with lower internet penetration. Some of you might not find that terribly useful. I don't either. But there are various demographics that yeah, the fine-tuned analysis can get you into. But auction sites, by the way, are also in COVID, and we can expect as our economic lives become more desperate to find more people trying to flog stuff or to invest in getting a job, for example, somewhere by paying an advance fee. So this is a dynamic area where it depends on opportunities and risks. Now, the standard Home Office cost model splits things up into transfer costs. That's what criminals get from you. So if, like me, you get regular emails telling you that you're, I've been watching you for a few weeks, I've had on camera all of your cyber porn explorations, and if you don't pay me in Bitcoin, then everybody's going to know about it. Well, first of all, I claim, and it's true, but I don't surf porn sites, but it's got an almost correct password that was no doubt hacked from one of the many websites that have been compromised. And I get these probably about 2 or 3 a week. And frankly, you know, I wish they'd just give me an example. But transfer costs are the costs of predatory crimes, anticipatory costs, defensive and precautionary, avoiding websites that are perceived as being insecure, whether or not they're actually so. So that's actually quite an important thing. What the banks are worried about is that we stop doing online banking. Though at the moment we don't have much choice because we're scared of some cyber event. Whether or not that's actually the case. So they spent quite a bit of effort in trying to reassure us in various ways, and we will never call you. Actually, it's not true, they do. But whether or not we're actually right about that, you know, there's a kind of market failure as I described it. How do you tell which websites are actually insecure and which ones aren't? You know, I thought British Airways might be secure until they hacked all the things and the various other incidents that I've had. And finally, reactive costs, that's criminal justice costs, currently very low. And civil litigation costs also quite low. And there are a whole load of non-police initiatives, which I haven't time to go into, but there's a lot of them. And lots of companies like to say we're supporting Take 5 to stop fraud, and you know, you can hardly move for falling over yourself over some advice online. But it's important to realize the private sector is selling prevention and it's post-strike investigation and protect service. But a lot of people, unless they're experts, have got no idea which ones are better or worse. The police are not allowed to recommend particular things because they might be seen as corrupt for doing that. And that's assuming they'd have the remotest idea anyway. And then there are current police initiatives, and there's a bewildering number of these. The National Cybersecurity, National Centre for Cybersecurity, they've got a new phishing reporting nationally. I've used it already quite a few times. But there's a confusion because if you're a victim of fraud, even if it's a phishing fraud, you're supposed to report that to Action Fraud in the City of London Police and not on the phishing line. But do people know that? How do they make that distinction? But obviously GCHQ were getting fed up with the bad reputation that Action Fraud has, so they thought they'd set up their own system for dealing with phishing and doing it in a more real-timey kind of way than the police typically do. But there's lots of different bits and pieces, as there are of the kinds of frauds that Nick and I often deal with. What about private and public policing? This is Lord Blair. He was then a mere knight. Mission of the police is to protect the weak, support the fearful and vulnerable, thank the helpful and lock up the bad guys. It's a typical dynamic authoritative police statement. They don't lock up many bad cyber guys. And in part of that, they require the private sector to be unpaid army of informants. And they try and get the private sector to pay for the policing of crimes for which the private sector finds public police powers useful, like the dedicated card and plastic crime unit of the City of London Police, which the banks pay for. But Germans would be horrified about this. They think this is a state function, and only a state function for policing. And the idea of private sector paying for police would be unimaginable. There's corporate investigation agencies for more complex e-crime cases, but that's expensive. And what technologies of policing are available and are actually used for financial crimes? Well, apart from seizing rape complainants, phones, they do have access to some commercial databases for cyber investigations. And they did have access, though they soon won't, to the Schengen database for cross-border offending and to Europol's EC3. That will finish. But otherwise, they have the stuff that they can afford, or that the police authorities let them afford. And there's quite a bit of explanations around for poor cooperation, overcrowded cybersecurity space. Very poor record in apprehension and prosecution of cyber criminals, indeed any kind of economic criminal. Historically poor engagement with small and medium enterprises. They don't have a day off to attend a not very interesting often set of cybersecurity speeches by people. It's difficult to justify a business case for any spending in austere times, but generally the work that I've done over the last couple of decades suggests to me that people only invest after they get hit. Because other people's crimes, unless they're people close to them and they've seen what's happened, they might, in their own kind of little peer group, invest if they see one of their peers get hit. But very few people spend a lot of money on prevention until they can identify some serious harm. Low levels of network capital and low police valuation of fraud and digital crime. And Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary have done several reports on this in the last few years. Technology itself can be a regulator. I haven't time to go into this, but my colleague Matt Williams, in his British Journal of Criminology article, Guardians Up on High, looked at identity theft, used the Eurobarometer and looked at different kinds of guardianship, personal guardianship in just avoiding websites, for example, or avoiding using the computer altogether, active personal guardianship, where you really focus on the threats that you know about, and passive physical guardianship, where you do less. The Eurobarometer also tells us about the variable use of the police for different kinds of crimes. Identity theft, for example, the most common reaction was to contact the police, but there were plenty of others, and it's quite a variety. The hacking of your social network or email account, the police came third, or quite a long way behind. Being asked for a payment in return for getting back control of your device, the police were the most common after nothing, but nothing was far and away the most common reaction, and the police were only contacted in under 20% cases. So there are some ambitions and key questions. The European Union is very common and keen on the phrase effective, proportionate and dissuasive sanctions. Does this mean anything? What's the role for prevent, incapacitation, freezing funds? Nick and I are interested in this issue. Yeah, there have been some cases where e-wallets have been frozen, but not many. How many police would recognize an e-wallet if they saw one? How many people at customs borders would recognize one? How could you open it? What would you do with it if you saw one? So there's some sort of forensic issues there. Deterrence, who are we trying to deter? Frontline offenders and their networks. Criminal commercial enterprises. I was talking recently to some government officials. How about prosecute Google or Facebook for selling adverts paid for by crime proceeds? Isn't that money laundering? Not much appetite for doing that, I have to say. But we need to differentiate organizational from individual impacts. And I'll whiz through. Reassurance policing is itself an important issue. Fear of crime, we're often told, is something to be worried about for its own sake, quite irrespective of crime, because fear is much more common than actual experience of crime. So there's a difference between feeling safer and or being safer. What are the objectives for which sectors and behaviours against which effectiveness can be judged? Well, we've seen what impact, well, I'm not sure that the fact that he drove to Durham actually had an impact. I have no doubt that Dominic Cummings would blame it all on media coverage. If the media hadn't covered it, his trip to Durham would have caused no harm at all. But these perceptions of behaviours, who needs the pursue by the police, and for what sorts of offenders, in what sorts of places is this realistic? You know, if the offenders are in Romania, which many are in the credit card fraud area, in theory they might be got back quite easily, at least until we leave the EU. But if they're in Ukraine or Russia or China, if they're state-sponsored or state-tolerated, what are the chances? What can be done about those constraints? And how do we sell those limitations to the public? Who are we using for third-party policing? I think designing out e-risks at source is perhaps an illusory goal. This is what crime prevention enthusiasts are always arguing for, designing out crime. But when you're rushing to get products to market, we're speaking on Zoom after all. You think of the security issues usually afterwards, when you've already got a strong market, or when you're afraid people might lose. You might lose a chunk of your market. So designing in prevention is quite hard. And there are various challenges for behavioral researchers in this. We have to convince people that this affects them personally. Heightening awareness is maybe not enough. We have to make it easier for them to do things to protect themselves. And that's been tricky, as we know from COVID, as we loosen up. At least you do in England, not in Wales. So some models for action, and I'll shut up. The targets for cyber fraud and extortion are very, very widespread. I mean, cyber attackers have got a problem. Do you pick on a normally well-defended corporation and hack till you find a weakness there? Well, they've been very successful in some cases. Or do you just try lots of small cons, like trying to, quite a lot of blokes do, look at pornographic websites, particularly, but not exclusively, during lockdown. So even though your hit rate may be very low, you don't need much of a return to put you in credit. And for those that, even though other cryptocurrencies are better than Bitcoin, more secure than Bitcoin, that's the only thing that an unsophisticated victim would be likely to recognize and be confident enough to actually use, if they are. But we don't know how many people give up, though they would pay. There would be extortionists. We need a lot more understanding of teachable moments to divert offending. The National Crime Agency do send around people or send them messages that, you know you were breaking the law when you did X, when you were surfing those websites. And they say that there's no data yet, that this is actually quite effective in turning people away. Whether that's true overseas, however, how are you going to convey that message to people in Romania, Ukraine, Russia, China, Nigeria? Who gives a shit about British victims if you live there? Nigerians, I know because we did some research on this, don't care much about Nigerian victims. So why should they care about British ones? Prevention should be built in. It's better probably bottom up, like in Estonia. But to expect a lot is probably too much. There's scope for experiments involving warning pop-ups on screen. So you have, if you like, fake scam adverts and then warn people, you could have been scammed here. But that involves a level of risky behavior because you're going to get complaints that the police have been very reluctant and GCHQ have been very reluctant to get into. Executives should consider if they really need the access privileges they have all the time, because if they get scammed by a CEO fraud, which are quite common in phishing scams, then the whole organization is at risk. So do you really need all that access? I'm the CEO, so it's partly a macho thing. And we need to identify individuals, businesses, and government departments who risk of repeat victimization and focus on the most vulnerable. But the core questions about how do we reduce anxiety without reducing actual prevention efforts? How do we promote resilience, especially where there's collateral damage before the first strike? There's a lot of symbolic action. I mean, I'm a member of Europol's advisory group. They and Interpol and the British police do takedowns of websites, botnets and dark markets. And that does reduce some harm. But we know from the research that we've done and people in Montreal have done that this doesn't last for very long, typically. But does it have a reassurance function, irrespective of whether it actually works in incapacitating offenders? That's what I mean by you've got to think about those as partly separate objectives. Now, far be it from me to suggest platonic noble lies in reassuring people falsely, though that's in fact what police do a lot of the time. But that's an issue to think about. Scope for experiments, I've already suggested. More focused internet governance could deal with global bads, but the politics of international opportunity reduction are very hard to achieve, even if we didn't have President Trump, President Xi, and President Putin in charge. That's not going to change anytime soon, or soon enough. But so in that respect, prospects for good international governance will have to be worked on very slowly. So basically, we have to learn to live with it, to be aware that we're going to have limited effects. And as Oscar Wilde rightly said, all of us are in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Well, we've had a series of questions come through via the chat. I have a few myself as well, but I'll keep those until the end, or perhaps until after the seminar. We can have a chat about that. So let me just work through the questions that have been submitted, although I do see that Danny Dresner has flooded the chat with a series of questions as well. But I'll start with a question from Gemma Irving around the role of advances in quantum computing and the extent to which quantum computing has changed the direction of research in your field.
It hasn't changed my direction of research at all, because I'm not doing any in that. Nor would I feel competent to do it. If you can't lie successfully, best not to. But I think it's shifted the direction of the high tech. I mean, we like Manchester have got one of the GCHQ funded cybersecurity centres, but I don't work in at that level of tech sophistication. But I think, amongst the consultancy firms, amongst the government, there is an awareness, and some business people and a lot of computer scientists, there's an awareness that these old models that we had of reaction, which in spite of the title I've been primarily talking about, may no longer be valid for much longer. They won't be eliminated, because what we have to realize is that most criminals by volume will not be using quantum computing until it's available as crime as a service attacks to them. But of course, one of the great things about cyber is that you can achieve a lot of harm with a very small number of people from afar. So yes, it's having a profound effect in people, in good computer scientists, thinking about how do we deal with these risks in a quantum world. But it's not having any effect at all on policing. It's not having much effect. Well, it's not having any effect on cybercrime prevention measures. Now, you could say, well, that's just typical because everybody's fighting the last war. But as an empirical statement, it's not having much effect.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, I'll take Danny's first question then, which relates to the number of people, or the split between people who did not contact the police when they'd been ransomed. How did they get their access back? In other words, did they A, rebuild their digital lives from scratch? Did they B, pay the ransom and their data were successfully restored? Or C, they had the wherewithal, like backups, to get back online with minimum of inconvenience? So do you have any insights into the balance between, or the proportion of victims across those three potential responses?
I don't, because the Eurobarometer didn't ask that question, and I had nothing to do with the Eurobarometer design. I may have something to do with the next one, but so on that particular answers, I expect those are individuals, not businesses, right? So that's your question's an excellent one for both categories. I expect a lot of people gave up or just got another computer, because after all, if you're an individual and if you've got access to, if you've got some of that data, then it may be cheaper and more sensible just to get a new, start afresh. But the level of distress that would have occasioned would be quite considerable. So I would call that a high harm incident. I have no idea what they did in response to that. There's some British research going on, it may even be yours, Danny, into ransomware, but I'm not sure they've asked those questions. The question about how you find out if people have been victims, what are your data set, if they haven't reported to anywhere and you haven't got a good general sampling, is a real one. But I expect people probably went to people they knew who knew something about IT, i.e. their kids or grandkids, and so if they could fix it, and if they couldn't, they possibly threw it away, unless the sum was small. So if you're, the biggest damage would probably be to SMEs or to large corporations or etc. Some American cities who were frozen have paid out and others haven't. The government usually says, well, even if you pay them, which we discourage, they may not give you back your full access. So I think it's an important question what lessons were actually learned and what improvements people make, but I can't answer that question. I may not be able to answer the rest, but it's a very good question.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, I'll perhaps save some of Danny's other questions for the end so we can get through questions posed by other people. So the next one from Pete Duncan, referring to your some models for action slide. And Pete's keen to know that if you had to pick one, which of these proposed actions would you say was the most important?
Oh, good one. Well, it would depend who I was. If I was a chief executive officer, I would reduce my access privileges. I can always ask somebody to get access to a bit of the organisation that I didn't really need. Though, of course, that might be another phishing scam. To pretend to be me to get that access. But that would be a more sophisticated CEO scam than we know about so far. If I was, but I'd think about better firewalls between different bits of my organization. And that would apply too if I was in government. I think if I was in a more populist vein, I think I'd be trying to reduce repeat victimization amongst the vulnerable, because in a sense that's a normal policing obligation, and there are most votes in that if I was aiming for votes. I think the pop-ups would encourage people to to take some measures. Yeah, I could have been ripped off, but they might just be more angry at me for pissing them about and making them feel feel vulnerable and like idiots that they could have been. So we don't actually know what the behavioural reaction is of people to those. But I would say that's there's no trade-offs between these. You've got a different set of measures for different people and different organizations in different situations. So I would say this is not a zero-sum game at all. if I were in charge of national security, which is not likely, I would say, well, yeah, the notion of what we call critical national infrastructure has been expanding all the time through the Internet of Things, and further going back to quantum computing. So both vulnerability and risk have been expanding quite a lot. So if I was in charge, I think one of the most important things for me to protect, and I'd say that as a national security advisor, as the CEO or CFO of a company, or CIO of a company, or as a sole proprietor, or as an individual. And the answer to that differs depending on who you are and what your risks are and what you've got awareness. But for a lot of vulnerable people in the normal human sense of the term vulnerable, not just probability of being victimized, but those who would be harmed the most, we need to think of more bottom-up strategies, like they do in Estonia, for kind of helping people through people they know, through local community things. So I don't think any of these are zero-sum games at all. So the question which is most important depends on who you are and when this is.
Good, thanks, Mike. Okay, next we have a question from Solomon Salah, an interesting question around the criminal justice system and the extent to which the justice system can consider or utilize evidence that has been collected from hacked systems of certain organizations.
In the area of cyber, well, yes, let me twist your question around. Arguably the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, because they needed a number, it was called that because they needed a number that was larger than the Panama Papers. Those were cyber crimes, as in WikiLeaks, according to conventional legal doctrine. So in that sense, tax information obtained about individuals, mostly wealthy individuals and companies, could be used in court against them, either civilly or criminally, or threats of it by tax agencies. Now, we don't know a lot about the use that has actually been made because tax agencies are very secretive about that. You can have a look at the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists and other kind of bodies for claims about effects, and occasionally it's trumpeted how much money has been recovered, but the criminal justice system has been used very little in relation to this, partly because the elites in different countries who've been exposed are still in place by and large. So why would they prosecute themselves? We know that in Russia, for example, in Khodorkovsky's case, tax demands are often a form of extortion by units within the state for their own personal or network benefit. Anyway, so we mustn't assume that all taxation, and this may be true of China too, but we don't know about it. Yes, it can be used. It's more likely to be used for tax returns, but you've got the same issue that you have with grand corruption. Basically, that where the people are in charge of the state, they're unlikely to act against themselves. So the general public may be knowledgeable, and foreign countries may intervene and freeze assets, for example, under the STAR initiative of the World Bank. My conclusion is that at least with the present generation of leaders, so long as they remain in power, the use that is made of this data will be much more limited. And the shaming effect may also be limited because it's actually more prestigious if everybody knows you've got a lot of assets abroad and they can't do anything about it. You just say, see, this is how powerful I am. So it's a very depressing conclusion. I'm not sure that was what you were getting at. If you weren't, then come back to me. But I think it is an important, yeah.
Yeah, well, Solomon can follow that up if you like in the chat. But I'll move on to the next question from Vlad Zahar around deepfake and where you think the now emerging field of deepfake will lie within new prevention schemes.
Yeah, well, I think what will happen is that Bellingcat and private exposers like that will be looking for the financial means to expand and do the kind of job they've been doing in the past. Government agencies will, unless the deepfakes are their own. The issue about making internet service providers responsible, I was going to talk about, but I had to make decisions about what I was going to include. But the ISP responsibility issue will limp on, and I think they will put some more effort into it, into stopping deep fakes. But I think the political constraints on that are quite severe. So I think it will probably fall largely into we can't really exercise prevent in the classic sense because we can't get to the people in those countries who are doing the faking. Because they're state sponsored or state tolerated, or they're just individuals with they can be anarchist or right wing or whatever groups with a political message. So I think again you've got to think about, well, what's the nature of those targets? So I think exposing, trying to hold up, to act more quickly against deep fake transmission, Trump notwithstanding, will be the technique that is deployed. But it's a very laborious and difficult process. And so I would expect deep faking to continue and to be stepped up.
Good. Okay, a question from Emma Barrett. So a comparative question between the prevent aspect of the cybercrime response and counter-terrorism prevent. So as Emma points out, these well-meaning intervention programs sometimes lack an evidence base or a lack of evaluation of the programs. There are messy boundaries between prevent and pursue. So to what extent do you think mistakes are being repeated with the response to cyber prevent in contrast to counter-terrorism prevent?
Mistakes will always be repeated. And the reason that I remember talking to somebody in the Foreign Office about this years ago, I said, sorry it's taken me a while to get back to you, but I've been dealing with a lot of legacy issues. And he replied, everything on my desk is a legacy. So that was a rather brilliant reply. I think the desire of police organizations, I was talking to Ken Pease about this, the desire of individual police officers and units and the governments to just do things. We know from the data on COVID, and I'm a member of the Crime Statistics Advisory Committee, which hasn't actually met for 2 years, But we know with the COVID data, this is just, most of that data is just nonsense. You just listen to more or less, and you have it exposed analytically, but they keep on doing it. Very difficult to avoid people just carrying on saying stuff that makes them feel good, feel powerful. I've had this experience in every area that I've ever worked in. And in a sense, it's up to people to call them out. So this is, what's the evidence base for this? I think, to be fair, the National Cybersecurity Centre is serious about evidence and data, and I think behavioural science. But a lot of stuff is, people are anxious. People want people to do something. And that's the temptation to respond, is to do stuff. So in every sphere, not just this. So I think they will make the same mistakes, but they may not see them as mistakes. I think it's less politically charged than counter-terrorism. And there are problems about what's the boundary between crime and hacking, and what is IP theft and what is getting for yourself stuff that is too expensive to be affordable, except by Manchester University Computing. Those are real kind of issues, but the CT issues are much more seriously ideological. But in a sense, that's why social scientists as well as computer scientists should, press for evaluation funds, not just in Cardiff, in Manchester City. To treat it seriously, but you've got to ask the right questions, not just how many times has this website for prevention had a hit, but also other questions. It's very difficult to work out the metrics of whether there's been an effect for cyber prevention programs. So at the moment, if you like, good-natured people giving good advice is often as far as we get.
I'll just go back to a question from Danny as well, which relates or follows on from the debates and the issues around counter-terrorism. Questions around the trade-off or the balance between security and civil liberties. And Danny posed a question about the balance and what the balance is between designing in forensic readiness and privacy. So I guess that's a question about the costs, the harms to the individual and the social costs as well, in contrast to crime control and prevention.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fundamental bit. I mean, I was one of the signatories to the large number of cyber gurus against the original version of the NHS Contact, because it wasn't clear what would happen to that data in the longer term. It still may not be clear. I mean, very few things that the government is currently doing are clear. So I think the civil liberties argument in designing stuff in, how many people read the contract terms when they sign up to something? How many people really care? We know that in general, people don't care a lot. And we may care a lot as individuals, and we may be afraid. But I think these issues about trade-offs, I mean, the Germans have a much clearer position on this because they, like my forebears, suffered both Nazism and Stasi surveillance. So they have a much bigger consciousness. So they, if you like, they design out a lot of data sharing. And within Europe, even Europe, including the UK for this purpose, there are a lot of variations on this theme. And I think, all we can do is to have debates about this and rely on the Information Commissioner's Office to intervene in some of those questions, or or force them to pressurize them to intervene. I mean, I was actually a member of the original advisory group of the data protection registrar in the olden days. I don't claim to keep up so well these days or these decades, but I think it's a very big issue, and of course we don't know the consequences of initial data sharing very often. People say, oh, well, it could lead to Nazi Germany or to, depending on your folk devil, or to Xi Jinping or to Putin. Yeah. It could lead to any of those things. Where along that slippery slope it actually will lie, yeah, when are we being paranoid in our fears of the totalitarian state? That's a matter for us all to make individual judgments about. I know quite a bit, but I don't claim to know that. But I think we've got to keep an active cyber interested community, whether computer scientists or criminologists or whoever, or lawyers engaged in those kinds of arguments. And I think the government, yeah, as in Ian Levy, no relation, he's with a Y, anglicised. Ian Levy's response, showed that they did take that seriously. Whether you believe in it or not is a separate question. There are people with far more computer knowledge than I, capable of disinterring those arguments. But I think we've got to keep them active and keep alert.
Indeed, stay alert. I just had a question, Mike, actually, about the offenders and the offending process. So a lot of your work has been around better understanding the crime commission process in relation to frauds and various other, serious financial crimes and so on. But from your research into cybercrime, what would you say the obstacles or problems are that cyber offenders encounter, and how do they overcome those as part of their crime commission process? And do those obstacles also emerge in offline crimes, or are they commonalities across, the offline and online world?
Yeah, well, we know far less about cyber offenders than we know about any other type of property criminal, including the more upmarket white-collar criminals that Nick and I have spent our time looking at. And if we ever get round to finishing that book, we'll further develop. But there are issues about samples of where you get cyber offenders from. I mean, Jonathan Lusthouse, whose PhD I examined in Oxford, has done some good work. There's other kind of good work about, but I would say if you're a skilled technical person, and particularly you've got other mates who are skilled, then you don't see many obstacles to your work. You might have an obstacle in cashing out, for example. How do the people who've got all those bitcoins from ransomware, what do they do with their money? How do they cash out the bitcoins? Is that a vulnerability to them? It should be, but it's only a vulnerability if people are kind of following them. It's not a vulnerability if nobody's following you. And I think most cyber offending people just get away with. Some of it is stopped in the money process. For example, if you're in romance scams, and your victims are wiring money through Western Union, it's kind of cyber transfer. Then that can be an obstacle, because actually those organisations, because of anti-money laundering controls, are devoting some effort to trying to pick that up and stop it. So I think the private sector is doing more than the public sector to at least delay and uphold. To delay and stop altogether. Those kinds. But I think the main obstacle for people who aren't that bright who aren't far enough along the autistic spectrum, the problem for them is getting crime as a service kit but the downside risks are currently very low, and that's why I think it's pretty weird that the police are not at least putting more of an effort into raising their perceived risks, even if the percentage affected is quite low. So there has been some quite active debate about whether traditional offenders are turning to cybercrime. And I think the balance of the argument is they probably aren't. They might be buying cheap, low value, high volume crime as a service stuff. But they get the same headache that many police officers get in venturing into that area. So they're probably just playing on their Xboxes at home, or doing other stuff. So I think so it's how difficult you find the tech process. So older offenders, like older criminologists, have more obstacles in mastering a skill, but they might have their own networks. But you can always find networks quite easily. Their main risk is, in some cases, infiltration from probably Americans or Dutch, or to a lesser extent British police trying to become administrators of web domain, or when dark web data is seized, the police coming around and knocking on their door and nicking them, or at least nicking those of them who've got contact with children, in the case of CEOP fraud. So it depends on the nature of the offence, but I think there's a limited number of people who are motivated and are competent to do sophisticated cyber crimes. I mean, what do we call sophisticated? Of course, sophisticated is a term of art, which I think we need to deconstruct.
On that final point, I was discussing that with Danny just last week, as I myself was a victim of the EasyJet hacking, which was a victim of a very highly sophisticated cybercrime, which we know nothing further about. So, like you say, how sophisticated are these scams? We don't actually know, do we?
Yeah. I mean, it's an easy term. I mean, frankly, anyone who travels on EasyJet deserves what they get. I mean, at least I got hacked by BA. I mean, no one is safe. I mean, it's just a term that gets used, and you have to try and deconstruct it. All it can mean is some lazy bugger wasn't careful enough in how they logged off, or, I mean, what is sophisticated? I mean, the company will claim that it was sophisticated, because if it wasn't sophisticated, they've done a crap job at protecting you.
Exactly. No company wants to admit to being done by an unsophisticated cybercrime, do they? So, yeah, that'll be the day when they admit to that. But anyway, it's way past 2 now. It's 2:10, so we should probably bring this webinar to a close. So, thanks, Mike. I'm sure.
Well, I'd like to thank you guys for a set of really interesting questions. The fact that I've been unable to answer them satisfactorily is not your fault. But I've enjoyed this far more than I might have expected.
Yeah, and I'm sure everybody is at home in silence and hidden clapping behind their computer screens, Mike, but we can't see that.
I'm just clapped out.
There's lots of nice messages coming in to say thank you. So thanks again, Mike. We'll call it a day there. And thank you all for attending and listening and posing some really interesting questions to Mike. Thank you.